I want to start with something that happened on March 14th, 2026, that almost nobody in the Western financial press fully explained. Iran announced that oil tankers wanting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which 20% of the world's oil flows every single day, can do so. But only if they settle their cargo in Chinese yuan, not US dollars. Yuan. Let that sit for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz has been the physical foundation of the petrodollar system since 1974. Every barrel of oil that moves through that waterway has been priced in dollars for 50 years. That dollar pricing is not just a financial convention. It is the mechanism that creates global demand for the US dollar. Countries need dollars to buy oil. That need for dollars is what gives America the ability to run $36.2 trillion in debt without the world losing faith in the currency that debt is denominated in. And on March 14th, 2026, Iran placed a weapon directly against that mechanism. I have been studying monetary systems and reserve currency cycles for over 40 years. I have watched empires rise and I have watched them decline. And I can tell you that what happened at the Strait of Hormuz this month is not a military story. It is a monetary system story. And it is the story that will define the next decade of the global economy more than any other event of our lifetimes. Here is exactly what is happening and why the financial architecture you grew up in is being stress-tested in ways it has not experienced in half a century. Let me start at the beginning, because if you don't understand how the petrodollar system was built, you cannot understand what is at stake right now. In 1971, President Nixon made a decision that changed the global financial system forever. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. Until that moment, the dollar was backed by gold. You could, in theory, hand in your dollars and receive gold in exchange. After August 15th, 1971, that was no longer true. The dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed not by a physical asset, but by the full faith and credit of the United States government. The immediate problem was obvious. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would the rest of the world continue to hold it as their primary reserve asset? What gave it value? The answer came 3 years later. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon negotiated a quiet agreement with Saudi Arabia. The terms were straightforward. America would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapons, security guarantees, a permanent military presence in the Gulf. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do two things. First, price all its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. Second, recycle the surplus dollar revenues from those oil sales, what became known as petrodollars, back into U.S. Treasury bonds. The rest of OPEC followed. By 1975, every major oil exporter had adopted dollar pricing, and the petrodollar system was born. Here is why this matters so profoundly. Oil is the world's most essential commodity. Every country needs it. Every country, therefore, needs dollars to buy it. That structural demand for dollars, demand that has nothing to do with America's economic performance or fiscal discipline, is what has allowed the United States to borrow at lower interest rates than any other government on earth, to run persistent trade deficits without a currency crisis, and to use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon through sanctions. It is the foundation of what former French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called America's exorbitant privilege. That privilege rests on one critical assumption: that oil will continue to be priced and settled in dollars. On March 14th, 2026, Iran put that assumption under direct military and financial pressure simultaneously. Here's where things get important. Let me walk you through the mechanism step by step, the way I would explain it to someone who has never thought about reserve currencies before. The Iran war began on February 28th. Within days, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to commercial shipping. Not completely, but war risk insurance premiums reached 7.5% of hull value by March 14th, according to Lloyd's of London, compared to 0.05% before the conflict. At those insurance costs, most commercial operators concluded that transiting the strait was economically impossible. The tanker traffic that normally moves 20 million barrels of oil per day dropped to near zero for Western-linked vessels. Then Iran made its announcement. Tankers can pass through the strait, but the cargo must be settled in yuan, not dollars. Yuan. Think about what that means mechanically. Iran is using physical control of the world's most important energy choke point to force a currency substitution in global oil trade. Every barrel that passes through Hormuz in yuan instead of dollars is one less reason for the countries buying that oil to hold dollar reserves. One less purchase of U.S. Treasury bonds. One less source of the structural demand for dollars that the petrodollar system creates. And here is what makes this moment different from every previous challenge to the petrodollar. This is not a theoretical proposal. This is not a BRICS summit communique about exploring alternatives. This is a military power using physical control of a geographic choke point to enforce a currency demand. Right now. Today. Bloomberg reported on March 15th that an Iranian supertanker pushed through the strait bound for China. Chinese tankers have been given passage. Indian tankers have negotiated access through diplomatic channels. Turkish tankers are transiting, and the vessels denied passage are those linked to the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. The Strait of Hormuz has become a de facto yuan settlement zone, and Saudi Arabia, the country whose 1974 agreement with Kissinger created the petrodollar system, is watching its airports being bombed and its oil fields struck as a direct consequence of a war launched by its American protector. The number you need to understand is not the oil price. The number you need to understand is $7 billion. That is the size of the currency swap agreement Saudi Arabia signed with China in 2023. And the infrastructure that agreement represents, the technical capability for yuan settlement of oil trades, was not built in response to this war. It was built in anticipation of a moment exactly like this. Let me tell you what happened on March 5th, 2026, that received almost no coverage in mainstream financial media. The Financial Times reported that 3 of the 4 largest Gulf economies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, had quietly begun reviewing whether they could invoke force majeure clauses in existing contracts with the United States and scale back hundreds of billions in future investment commitments. Think about what that sentence means. The Gulf states that built the petrodollar system that recycled trillions of dollars into American debt and kept the dollar as the world's reserve currency for 50 years are reviewing whether to back away from their commitments to the United States. Not because they want to, because the war launched by their protector is bombing their airports and striking their oil fields. The petrodollar arrangement was never a formal treaty. It rested on mutual interest and the absence of any credible alternative. For 50 years, those conditions held. Both conditions are now being tested simultaneously. Layer 1. The infrastructure already exists. Saudi Arabia effectively ended its exclusive commitment to dollar pricing in June 2024, before this war began. It has built the technical infrastructure for yuan settlement through that $7 billion currency swap with China and participation in the mBridge payment platform. In March 2026 alone, mBridge, the digital payment system that allows central banks to settle trade directly in their own currencies, bypassing the U.S. banking system and the SWIFT network entirely, handled over $55 billion in trade. Let me explain exactly how this mechanism works, because most investors have never been taught the operational reality of what replacing the dollar actually means. When a Chinese importer buys Saudi oil under the old system, they must first convert yuan to dollars, execute the transaction through a New York clearing bank that reports to the U.S. Treasury. Then the Saudis receive dollars they must either hold or convert. Every step creates dollar demand. Every step runs through American financial infrastructure. Every step gives Washington visibility and control. Under mBridge, the transaction settles directly. Yuan to real, central bank to central bank, no New York intermediary, no SWIFT message, no dollar needed at any point in the chain. The system went live in 2024 with 5 central banks participating. By March 2026, that number had grown to 26 central banks, representing $18 trillion in combined GDP. The infrastructure for a post-petrodollar world was not built in response to this war. It was built in anticipation of a moment like this. And that moment has now arrived. Layer 2. The protection guarantee has been visibly broken. The 1974 petrodollar agreement rested on one implicit promise. America would protect the Gulf states when they needed protection. In March 2026, Saudi airports are being bombed. Oil facilities are being struck. And the American protection that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario has instead triggered it. The test results are not encouraging for the dollar. Layer 3. The yuan settlement precedent is being normalized in real time. Every energy importing nation is now recalculating the currency risk embedded in its supply chain geography. Every central bank watching this unfold is asking the question that Ray Dalio has been raising for years. If the United States can weaponize the dollar against Russia, against Iran, against Venezuela, what happens to our dollar reserves if we ever find ourselves on the wrong side of American foreign policy? That question does not go away when the Iran war ends. It gets louder. Now, I want to be very precise about what this means and what it does not mean, because I think the most important thing I can give you here is an accurate map, not a dramatic one. The dollar is not about to collapse. Let me say that clearly. The yuan is not ready to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. China maintains capital controls. Its financial markets are not as open, liquid, or trusted as American ones. The legal protections and institutional depth of dollar-based markets have no equivalent in yuan-based systems. What is happening is something more subtle and over a long-time horizon more consequential: acceleration. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been declining gradually for years, from around 71% in 2000 to approximately 58% today. That erosion happened slowly, without a single dramatic catalyst. What the 2026 Iran war has done is provide multiple catalysts simultaneously. Iran demanding yuan at Hormuz does not create a new direction in global finance. It accelerates an existing one. Saudi Arabia reviewing its petrodollar commitments does not mean Riyadh will price oil in yuan tomorrow. It means the 50-year assumption underlying the system that America would protect the Gulf states when they needed protection has been visibly, publicly, and dramatically tested. And the test results are not encouraging. Here's what I think the two scenarios look like from here, because this is the most useful thing I can offer you. Scenario 1. The war ends relatively quickly. The strait reopens. Oil flows resume in dollars. In this scenario, the petrodollar system survives. But it survives damaged. Saudi Arabia's airport bombing is not forgotten. The yuan settlement experiment at Hormuz has demonstrated that it is technically possible to price oil in a non-dollar currency through a major choke point. The M-Bridge infrastructure remains operational. Central banks that were already quietly reducing dollar reserves accelerate that reduction. The dollar's share of global reserves continues its long decline, moving faster than it would have without this war. Gold continues to benefit as the asset that carries no counterparty risk and no government can freeze. Scenario 2. The war extends. The Hormuz closure becomes semi-permanent, and the yuan settlement precedent becomes normalized across Asian energy trade. In this scenario, which I consider less probable but not negligible, the structural demand for dollars begins to erode measurably. Countries that need Gulf oil begin building yuan reserves to access it. Treasury bond demand from petrodollar recycling declines. Let me show you the arithmetic of what that erosion actually means. Approximately 20 million barrels per day flow through Hormuz under normal conditions. At $85 per barrel, that is $1.7 billion in daily transactions. Over a year, $620 billion in oil trade. Under the petrodollar system, that entire amount created dollar demand. Buyers needed dollars. Sellers received dollars. A significant portion of those dollars, historically 30% to 40%, flowed into U.S. Treasury purchases. Now assume 50% of that trade shifts to yuan settlement over 18 months. Not all of it, just half. That is $310 billion annually in transactions that no longer require dollars, and $93 billion to $124 billion per year in Treasury purchases that no longer happen. For context, the U.S. Treasury needs to sell $9.2 trillion in new and refinanced debt this fiscal year. Losing $100 billion in structural demand from petrodollar recycling means yields must rise to attract alternative buyers, or the Federal Reserve must step in as the buyer of last resort, which means money printing. The United States, which relies on that demand to finance its $36.2 trillion debt at manageable interest rates, faces upward pressure on borrowing costs at precisely the moment when its fiscal position is already the most stretched in peacetime history. In Scenario 2, the consequences for every dollar-denominated asset, stocks, bonds, real estate, cash savings are significant. And the assets that benefit are the ones that I have watched central banks accumulate for 3 consecutive years at double the historical rate: gold, real assets, and non-dollar reserve currencies. I want to tell you what Ray Dalio himself has said about this because his public assessment of the current situation is the most precise framing I have seen from any investor of his stature. He warned directly that if Iran or other regional actors require alternatives like the Chinese yuan for energy transfers through the Strait of Hormuz, the decades-old petrodollar system could collapse. If this scenario materializes, the dollar would lose its status as the global reserve currency. The United States would become unable to finance its debts at current rates, and its global power would rapidly begin to contract. He emphasized that the current world order is seriously cracking, and that reading this process merely as a geopolitical crisis would be a mistake. It is also an era of massive wealth transfer, and he stressed that to survive systemic changes of this magnitude, investors must pivot toward diversified portfolios and real assets as a vital necessity. I agree with every word of that assessment, and I have been arriving at the same conclusion through the same analytical framework for the past several years. Here is what I think you should understand about your own financial position right now. The most important insight I can offer is this: the dollar losing reserve currency status is not a binary event that happens overnight. It is a process, one that has already been underway for years. One that this war has dramatically accelerated, and one that will continue regardless of how the immediate military conflict resolves. In that context, the question is not whether to abandon dollar assets entirely. The question is whether your portfolio is positioned to reflect the reality that the dollar's share of the global financial system is declining and that the assets that benefit from that decline deserve a larger allocation than most retail investors currently have. Gold is the most obvious beneficiary, not because gold goes up when there is a war. As the recent crash demonstrated, that is not always true in the short term. But because gold is the only monetary asset that carries no counterparty risk, no issuer whose fiscal decisions can debase it, and no government that can freeze it through a sanctions order, those properties are worth more in a world where the weaponization of the dollar has demonstrated that dollar assets can be confiscated at a sovereign level. Central banks understand this. They have been buying gold at double the historical average for 3 consecutive years. They were not doing this because of the Iran war. They were doing this in anticipation of a world where the dollar's exorbitant privilege was being eroded. The war has simply confirmed their thesis faster than any of them anticipated. Let me close with the big picture. The petrodollar system was built in 1974 on 3 pillars: stable Gulf energy production, dollar-denominated oil trade, and American military protection of the Gulf. All 3 pillars are now under simultaneous stress for the first time in 50 years. Iran demanding yuan at Hormuz is not the end of the petrodollar, but it is the moment that historians will point to when they describe when the system's vulnerability became undeniable. Not theoretical, not gradual, undeniable. The most dangerous thing an investor can do right now is look at this moment and conclude that because the dollar has not collapsed yet, it will not. Reserve currency transitions do not announce themselves with a single day of crisis. They accumulate through a series of moments, each one individually survivable, collectively decisive, until the system has shifted so far that the shift becomes self-reinforcing. I have studied the decline of the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and every other reserve currency in modern history. In every case, the moment the transition became unstoppable looked at the time like just another crisis that would eventually pass. The Iran war may pass. The yuan settlement precedent at Hormuz will not. This was not a military story. It was not an oil price story. It was a story about the moment when the 50-year foundation of dollar dominance was surgically targeted by a military power using geography as a monetary weapon. The petrodollar system survived because oil had to be priced in dollars. Iran just proved that it does not. The infrastructure exists. The precedent is being set. The protection guarantee has been tested and found wanting. Watch this carefully. Understand the mechanism, and position accordingly. Not in panic, but with the clear-eyed recognition that the monetary system you grew up in is being stress-tested in ways it has not experienced in half a century. Most investors don't know the difference between a temporary crisis and a structural shift. Now you do.